Right now, there's a good chance your kitchen is already stocked with food. But what most people never stop to think about is this. A lot of those supplies may be practically useless when a real problem hits. And it's not necessarily because you purchased the wrong items. The truth is, most crises don't arrive with dramatic headlines or completely empty grocery shelves overnight. More often, it feels like an ordinary Tuesday when that one thing you always count on suddenly isn't available anymore. Then a few days pass, and little by little, things start changing. You eat less without meaning to, your energy drops, your focus gets worse, and even simple decisions become harder to make. Meanwhile, your cabinets may still look full, but the food inside either isn't useful, isn't satisfying, or has become something you no longer even want to eat. That's the real problem most people overlook. It's not just about running out of food entirely, it's about having supplies that fail you when you actually need them. And here's the part that catches people off guard. It doesn't take a total system breakdown to create shortages. Even a small disruption, something as minor as a 10% slowdown in freight and deliveries, can wipe certain products off store shelves in less than 2 days. No collapse, no chaos, just a slight interruption is enough. That's why these 12 items matter far more than most people realize. And the item sitting at number 1? The majority of households don't even have it in their homes. Number 12 is peanut butter. And before dismissing it as too basic, ask yourself one simple but very honest question. If the power went out tonight and you had no stove, no running water, no microwave, and no time or energy to cook, how many foods in your house could you immediately eat without any preparation at all? For most people, the answer is surprisingly small. A lot of households technically have plenty of food stored away. There's rice in the pantry, pasta on the shelf, canned goods stacked in cabinets, maybe bags of dried beans too. But most of those foods still depend on something else. They require heat, water, cookware, time, planning, or at the very least the mental energy to prepare them. And that difference between food you own and food you can instantly use is exactly why peanut butter deserves a place on this list. One serving contains close to 190 calories, and it requires absolutely nothing from you. No cooking, no refrigeration, no electricity, no cleanup, and no thinking ahead. You twist open the lid, grab a spoon if you want one, and eat. It almost sounds too simple to matter, but simplicity is exactly what makes it valuable. Here's why that matters more than people realize. In the United States today, well over half of all meals eaten at home are being replaced with takeout or fast food. It's not always because people lack groceries. Most already have ingredients sitting in their kitchens. The real issue is exhaustion, lack of time, stress, or simply not having the energy to cook after a long day. They possess food, but they don't have the conditions needed to turn those ingredients into a meal. That distinction becomes even more important during disruption. Once routines start breaking down and stress levels rise, cooking is no longer automatic. Suddenly, every meal becomes another decision to make. And decision-making takes energy, which is usually one of the first things people lose when life becomes unstable or overwhelming. Peanut butter removes that problem completely. You don't need motivation, organization, or a clear head. You just eat and keep moving. Skipping a single meal usually isn't catastrophic. But after 2 or 3 missed meals in a short period, even within only a couple of days, people begin experiencing noticeable drops in concentration, energy, patience, and judgment. Hunger adds stress, and stress leads to worse choices. It becomes a cycle that feeds itself. Peanut butter helps interrupt that downward spiral before it even starts. An unopened jar typically lasts anywhere from 6 months to a year, often even longer when stored correctly. It doesn't require refrigeration, it's inexpensive for the amount of calories it provides, and keeping just 2 or 3 jars in the house creates a reliable safety buffer for the moments when you're exhausted, overwhelmed, or simply not functioning at your best. And realistically, those ordinary difficult days are usually when preparation matters the most. The next item on this list may seem completely unrelated at first glance, but it solves the very same hidden problem from a direction that most preparedness advice never even talks about. Number 11 is powdered milk. And this is where most preparedness advice starts missing something important. People usually measure readiness by calories, protein, carbohydrates, and shelf life. But there's another factor that has a massive impact during stressful situations, and it rarely gets discussed. Psychological stability. Study after study has shown that even small disruptions to familiar routines can noticeably affect a person's mood, focus, and overall sense of control. Something as simple as morning coffee prepared differently, missing a familiar breakfast, or losing a routine you normally do without thinking can quietly throw off the entire tone of the day. Not because of nutrition, but because routines act like emotional anchors. They tell the brain that life is still manageable and predictable. When those routines suddenly disappear, that feeling of stability disappears with them. And the effect is real. Stress tolerance drops, decision-making becomes worse, and emotions become harder to regulate. Fresh milk is one of the first everyday items to vanish when transportation systems slow down. Even under perfect refrigeration, regular milk only lasts around 5 to 10 days, and the entire supply depends on a constant refrigerated distribution chain. The moment deliveries start slowing regionally, dairy sections empty incredibly fast. In many cases, milk disappears from shelves within 2 days, and in moderate disruptions, shortages can easily stretch for a week or longer. Powdered milk obviously isn't identical to fresh milk. The texture changes a little, and the flavor is never exactly the same. But that's not really why it matters. Its real value comes from preserving familiarity. Being able to pour milk into your morning coffee, prepare oatmeal the same way you always do, or keep breakfast feeling normal has a bigger effect than most people expect. Those small routines create rhythm, and maintaining that rhythm for even 5 to 7 difficult days can help people stay calmer, more focused, and emotionally steadier. It doesn't take much either. Roughly 20 to 30 grams mixed with water is often enough to preserve that sense of normalcy in the morning. And when the morning feels stable, the rest of the day usually becomes easier to manage too. Sealed powdered milk can last anywhere from 1 to 2 years without refrigeration or any cold storage system. It also retains much of the calcium, protein, and fat-soluble vitamins found in fresh milk, making it practical nutritionally as well. For families with children, this becomes even more important. Kids tend to react more strongly to disrupted routines, unfamiliar foods, and sudden changes in daily structure. Familiar meals don't just provide nutrition for them, they also provide comfort, predictability, and emotional balance. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can store isn't simply calories or nutrients. Sometimes it's the ability to preserve a feeling of normal life when everything around you starts feeling uncertain. And the next item on this list proves that point even more clearly, because its true value has almost nothing to do with what appears on the nutrition label. Number 10 is honey. On paper, it doesn't seem especially impressive. 1 teaspoon contains roughly 60 calories, which by itself is not a major nutritional contribution. Compared to foods packed with protein or long-lasting carbohydrates, honey can almost look unnecessary. But the reason honey belongs on this list has very little to do with calories. Here's what often happens during periods of disruption. After 4 or 5 days of eating the same repetitive meals over and over again, the issue usually isn't that the food has completely run out. The food is still sitting there. You're still technically hungry. But mentally, something changes. You open another can, prepare the same meal again, stare at it for a moment, and suddenly feel no desire to eat it. So you put it off. Maybe you eat half as much as you should. Maybe you skip the meal entirely. Not because supplies are gone, but because the experience itself has become emotionally exhausting and monotonous. And this isn't just about being picky. It's an actual physiological response that researchers have documented. When the brain keeps receiving identical sensory input repeatedly, the same taste, the same smell, the same texture day after day, the reward response tied to eating begins to weaken. Appetite drops, interest in food declines, and calorie intake often decreases noticeably within just a few days. A small amount of sweetness helps interrupt that cycle. Not because honey suddenly transforms the nutritional value of the meal, but because it changes the sensory experience enough for the brain to register something different. That tiny shift can restore a more normal appetite and make eating feel manageable again. In that sense, honey functions less like a survival food and more like a behavioral tool. And that's exactly why so many preparedness lists underestimate it. It also has one of the best storage profiles of almost any food item available. Thanks to its naturally low moisture content and antimicrobial properties, properly stored honey can remain usable for years. Keep it sealed and away from excessive heat, and it stays remarkably stable without refrigeration, electricity, or special handling. Even a small jar can last surprisingly long. 1 or 2 spoonfuls per day can stretch over several weeks while still providing comfort and variety during stressful periods. And honey offers another small advantage people rarely think about. Mixed into warm water with lemon, or even combined with a little vinegar, it can help soothe throat irritation, something that becomes more common during dry indoor conditions, dehydration, or heating disruptions. That may sound minor, but small comforts matter more than people expect when daily life becomes unpredictable. Tiny improvements in morale and routine often have a larger effect than raw nutrition alone. The next item on this list is something most homes already have somewhere in the kitchen. The problem is that almost nobody keeps enough of it for the kind of disruption people are actually likely to face. Number 9 is spices and sauces. And this is where things start getting counterintuitive. One of the most surprising findings in food behavior research is that a person can technically have weeks of food available and still begin functioning as if they're running out within only a few days. Not because the calories disappear, but because they gradually stop eating enough of them. Studies on repetitive diets consistently show the same pattern. After just 3 to 5 days of eating identical flavors over and over, voluntary food intake can drop by roughly 20 to 30%. The meals themselves haven't changed. The calories are still sitting right there. But the desire to keep eating slowly fades in ways that are measurable and surprisingly predictable. And this has nothing to do with discipline or weak willpower. It's a neurological response. The scientific term for it is sensory-specific satiety. Once the brain receives the same taste, smell, and texture repeatedly beyond a certain point, its positive reward response begins to weaken. People start eating more slowly, portions naturally become smaller, and without realizing it, they begin consuming fewer calories than their bodies actually need. What makes this tricky is that most people don't experience it as obvious hunger. They simply delay meals, lose interest in food, snack less, or unconsciously eat smaller portions. Over several days, that gradual calorie deficit begins affecting concentration, energy, mood, patience, and physical performance. A small flavor change can completely interrupt that process. Something as simple as a few drops of hot sauce, a spoonful of soy sauce, a little garlic powder, or a pinch of cumin can make the brain interpret the meal as different enough to reset the eating response. Research on flavor variation suggests that even modest changes in a meal's sensory profile can restore more normal food intake. Nutritionally, the meal may be almost identical, but psychologically, it no longer feels repetitive. And often, that alone is enough. That's why spices and sauces matter far more than most preparedness guides suggest. One bottle of sauce can stretch across 15 or 20 meals. A single jar of dried seasoning may flavor dozens more. Most dried spices also last for years when stored properly, usually 2 to 3 years or longer, while costing very little compared to the impact they provide. Realistically, you don't need an enormous collection. 3 to 5 versatile spices combined with 1 or 2 familiar sauces is usually enough. The goal isn't gourmet cooking. It's maintaining consistent eating behavior when meal options become limited and repetitive. Because when variety disappears, appetite often disappears with it. And the next item may look like something you'd normally leave beside a salad dressing bottle, but it serves 2 important purposes that nothing else on this list really covers. Number 8 is vinegar. At first glance, it probably seems like the strangest item on this entire list. It contains almost no calories, contributes basically nothing in terms of protein or nutrients, and certainly isn't something that fills you up. From a survival food perspective, it almost looks pointless. So why include it at all? Because vinegar solves 2 very specific problems that most other pantry items don't address. The first benefit is flavor and food acceptance. When people are stuck eating repetitive meals for several days in a row, the biggest issue often isn't the amount of food available. It's the growing difficulty of forcing yourself to keep eating the same bland meals over and over again. A very small amount of vinegar, sometimes just a teaspoon or 2 added to rice, beans, vegetables, or canned foods, can completely change how the meal feels. The acidity cuts through heaviness, brightens dull flavors, and makes simple foods noticeably easier to eat. Research on food palatability has repeatedly shown that acidic ingredients improve how people perceive plain or repetitive meals, and that matters more than it sounds. A meal that felt difficult to finish suddenly becomes manageable again, which directly helps maintain more stable calorie intake day after day. The second reason vinegar matters is preservation. Because vinegar contains roughly 5% acetic acid, it creates an environment that slows bacterial growth under certain conditions. Foods prepared or mixed with vinegar can sometimes remain usable for an extra 24 to 48 hours compared to foods stored without it. When refrigeration becomes unreliable or inconsistent, even a small extension like that becomes valuable. Of course, vinegar is not a substitute for proper food safety or refrigeration. It's not magic. But during limited or degraded conditions, it becomes a practical support tool that helps stretch usability a little further. And its usefulness goes far beyond food. Vinegar also works as a multi-purpose household item. It can help clean surfaces, reduce odors, assist with basic sanitation tasks, and support simple food safety routines, all without requiring electricity or specialized equipment. One inexpensive bottle can serve dozens of different functions around the house. Its storage life is another major advantage. Kept sealed, vinegar remains stable for essentially an unlimited amount of time. It's one of the cheapest products on this entire list, yet it delivers one of the highest usefulness to cost ratios you can realistically keep in a preparedness pantry. The next item is something almost every household already owns in some quantity, but most people make the exact same mistake with it without ever realizing it. Number 7 is salt. Picture this for a moment. Dinner tonight is plain rice, canned beans, and a few canned vegetables. No seasoning, no sauces, no salt. The first day, it's tolerable. Maybe not exciting, but manageable. Then, the same meal appears again the next day. By day 3, something starts changing quietly in the background. Most people begin eating noticeably smaller portions, not because they're fully satisfied, but because the act of eating has started to feel like a chore instead of something naturally enjoyable. The motivation to eat slowly fades. And this isn't simply about personal taste or being picky, it's a well-documented response. Research shows that meals lacking enough sodium can significantly reduce appetite, especially when the diet is already repetitive and limited in variety. Even when people are genuinely hungry, low-sodium meals can lead to voluntary food intake dropping by roughly 10 to 20% over the course of several days. That decline may not seem dramatic at first, but over time it adds up. Lower calorie intake begins affecting energy levels, concentration, mood, and physical performance in very real ways. But salt matters for another reason too, and this is the part most people overlook completely. Salt isn't just a seasoning. Sodium is one of the body's primary electrolytes. It plays a central role in fluid balance, nerve signaling, muscle contraction, and overall physical function. For most adults, the recommended daily sodium intake sits around 2,300 milligrams. When sodium intake consistently falls below useful levels, the body doesn't suddenly fail overnight. Instead, performance gradually becomes less efficient. Focus weakens. Reaction time slows. Physical stamina declines little by little. Individually, those changes can be hard to notice, but over multiple days, the cumulative effect becomes significant. And then there's iodine, which is the hidden issue almost nobody thinks about. Iodized salt remains one of the most common and accessible sources of iodine in the modern diet. If it disappears and people unknowingly switch entirely to non-iodized alternatives, a nutritional gap begins forming quietly in the background. There are usually no immediate warning signs, which makes it even easier to ignore. But over time, iodine deficiency can interfere with thyroid function, energy regulation, mental clarity, and cognitive performance. It's a slow decline that develops gradually enough for many people not to recognize what's happening until the effects become more noticeable. From a storage perspective, salt is almost impossible to beat. Kept dry and protected from moisture, it essentially lasts forever. Just a few kilograms of iodized salt can support hundreds upon hundreds of meals while costing very little. In terms of usefulness for the price, it's easily one of the most efficient items you can keep in a preparedness pantry. And if this list is starting to change the way you think about what actually matters during disruptions, then the next item will probably surprise you even more. Number 6 is stored protein. And this is one of the most deceptive problems on the entire list because, at first, it barely feels like a problem at all. Meals are still happening. You're still eating regularly. On the surface, everything appears normal enough. Calories are coming in, hunger is mostly under control, and nothing seems obviously wrong. But underneath that surface, the body may already be compensating for something important that's missing. Adults generally need somewhere around 50 to 70 grams of protein each day to maintain muscle tissue, support the immune system, and handle the constant repair work the body performs internally. When protein intake falls too low for too long, the body doesn't suddenly shut down or send dramatic warning signs. Instead, it quietly adapts. To keep essential systems running, the body begins breaking down its own muscle tissue and redirecting those proteins toward more critical functions. And the dangerous part is how gradual the process feels. There's usually no pain, no immediate alarm, and no single moment where the problem becomes obvious. The effects build slowly in the background. You may notice it takes longer to recover after physical activity. Small cuts or minor injuries heal more slowly than usual. Fatigue starts showing up earlier in the day. Physical performance drops little by little, maybe by 10 or 15%, but enough to become noticeable over time. Energy feels lower, motivation weakens, and yet there's no clear explanation because technically you're still eating and still functioning. You just aren't functioning as well as you were a week earlier. And during disruptions, protein is often the first major food category to become unreliable. Fresh meat depends completely on a stable refrigerated supply chain. The moment transportation or distribution slows even slightly, cold chain products are usually among the first things affected. Prices rise quickly, shelves thin out, and protein suddenly becomes one of the hardest and most expensive essentials to replace. Unfortunately, that tends to happen at the exact moment the body needs stable nutrition the most. That's why shelf-stable protein matters so much. Dry foods like lentils, chickpeas, black beans, and other legumes can provide roughly 15 to 20 grams of protein per cooked cup while lasting several years in storage. Canned fish offers around 20 to 25 grams per serving and often stays usable for 3 to 5 years. Canned meats provide complete protein immediately, with virtually no preparation beyond opening the container. You don't need a massive stockpile either. Even a 5 to 7 day reserve of reliable protein sources can prevent the slow, compounding decline that begins when intake remains too low for extended periods. The next item is something most people assume will always be available whenever they need it. And that exact assumption is what turns it into a vulnerability. Number 5 is shelf-stable vegetables. Fresh produce is actually one of the most fragile parts of the entire modern food system. That's not speculation or exaggeration. It's simply the reality of how tightly timed the distribution process has become. Most fruits and vegetables move from harvest to store shelves within a very narrow window, often only 2 to 5 days. Because of that, even a relatively small delay somewhere in transportation or distribution, sometimes just 24 to 48 hours, can noticeably reduce quality and shrink the amount of produce available in stores. Once supply pressure begins building, prices for fresh vegetables can climb fast, often jumping 10 to 25% within a single week. In longer disruptions, certain items may disappear entirely from regional markets for days at a time. The problem is that people usually don't notice the impact immediately. Going a few days without enough vegetables doesn't create dramatic symptoms overnight. And that delayed effect is exactly what makes it risky. Micronutrient deficiencies build gradually, not suddenly. Vegetables are major sources of nutrients like vitamins C and K, folate, potassium, and magnesium. When intake drops for long enough, usually somewhere around 10 to 14 days or more, the consequences slowly begin appearing. Recovery after physical effort becomes slower. Immune function weakens. Energy levels become less stable. Mental sharpness and concentration decline little by little. None of these changes feel dramatic on their own, but together they start reducing overall performance in noticeable ways. Canned and dried vegetables are not perfect substitutes for fresh produce, and they're not meant to be. Some nutrients, especially heat-sensitive vitamins like vitamin C, are reduced during processing. But most minerals remain intact, fiber is largely preserved, and fat-soluble vitamins tend to survive storage surprisingly well. And unlike fresh produce, shelf-stable vegetables don't depend on refrigeration. constant transportation, or rapid distribution cycles. Commercial canned vegetables usually remain usable for 1 to 2 years or longer. Just 1 or 2 servings per day can help maintain a nutritional baseline during a disruption lasting several weeks. That's really the goal here. Not achieving perfect nutrition under stressful conditions, but preventing the slow decline that comes from prolonged deficiency. And if this list has changed the way you think about preparedness even a little, then you're already seeing the difference between simply storing food and storing food that actually helps you function well when conditions become unstable. Number 4 is base carbohydrates. There's a very specific experience most people don't immediately recognize until they've lived it. You eat what looks like a complete meal, protein, some fat, vegetables, enough calories on paper, and yet, about an hour or an hour and a half later, something still feels incomplete. It's not strong hunger, just a subtle sense that you're not fully satisfied. You end up back in the kitchen sooner than expected, eating again, and still not feeling properly done with food. That's often what happens when a meal is missing a proper carbohydrate foundation. Complex carbohydrates typically provide around 4 calories per gram and are processed in a way that releases energy more gradually compared to protein or fat. Foods like rice, oats, pasta, and potatoes create a steadier energy curve that tends to support longer-lasting fullness, often around 3 to 4 hours for many people. When that base is missing, the body burns through available energy more quickly. Hunger tends to return sooner, and meal frequency naturally increases as the body tries to compensate. But even with more frequent eating, that deeper sense of satisfaction never fully stabilizes. Instead of 2 or 3 solid meals a day, people may drift into 4 or 5 smaller eating sessions without ever feeling properly sustained. More food ends up being consumed overall, but it doesn't necessarily translate into better satiety. Nutritionists sometimes refer to complex carbohydrates as a kind of dietary anchor. They don't just provide energy on their own. They help tie together protein, fat, and micronutrients into a meal that actually feels complete. Without that anchor, even a well-balanced plate can feel oddly unfinished in a way that's hard to explain in the moment. This is why simple staples matter so much. Even something as basic as 1 or 2 kilos of rice, a supply of rolled oats, or a familiar stock of pasta can completely change how well the rest of your food supply functions. These ingredients become the foundation that allows everything else on the list to actually work the way it's supposed to. Number 3 is cooking fats. This is one of those gaps most people don't notice until they're actually standing in their kitchen trying to cook under limited conditions. Imagine a pantry that looks fully stocked. There's rice, beans, canned vegetables, and even stored protein. On paper, everything is there for complete meals. You start cooking, everything seems fine at first, and then you realize there's no oil or cooking fat available. The first day, you might get by. It feels slightly inconvenient, but manageable. By the third day, everything starts to change. Food begins sticking to the pan more easily, cooking becomes slower and more frustrating, and the final result tastes noticeably worse. Meals that should feel simple start feeling like a chore. And that matters more than it seems. When food becomes harder and less pleasant to prepare, people naturally begin eating less of it. Not because the food is gone, but because the entire experience of cooking and eating it becomes less appealing. Intake drops gradually, and over time that creates a real energy gap without it being obvious at first. Cooking fats provide about 9 calories per gram, which makes them more than twice as energy-dense as carbohydrates or protein. When they're missing, total energy intake can fall significantly, even if the volume of food looks exactly the same. You might still feel like you're eating enough, but the actual usable energy your body is getting doesn't match that perception. There's also another layer that most people don't think about at all. Vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble, which means the body can't properly absorb them without dietary fat present. If fat intake drops too low for an extended period, the absorption of these essential vitamins can fall dramatically, sometimes by more than half. So even a varied diet can still lead to nutritional deficiencies if the body doesn't have the fat needed to process it. This doesn't happen after a single missed day, but over several days of consistently low-fat intake, the effect becomes real. And despite all of this, cooking fats are often the first thing people cut when prices rise or supplies feel uncertain because they seem optional or replaceable. In reality, they're one of the least optional components of a functional kitchen. Cooking oil prices have also seen sharp fluctuations in recent years, sometimes rising 20 to 40% in short cycles due to supply and transportation issues. When that happens, households tend to reduce usage first, even though it plays a central role in both energy intake and nutrient absorption. The next item is something most people don't even think of as part of food preparedness, yet it quietly determines whether any of the food you store actually works the way it should. Number 2 is ready-to-eat foods. One of the most common ideas in food preparedness sounds completely logical on the surface. If you have enough ingredients at home, you'll just cook when the time comes. The problem is that this assumption tends to fail far more often than people expect, and not because of a lack of discipline. What actually changes first during a disruption isn't the food itself, but the conditions around it. Daily routines become unpredictable. Stress levels rise and accumulate. Electricity or gas may not disappear entirely, but they can become unreliable enough to make cooking more complicated or inconvenient. Workdays stretch longer than expected, and by the time someone finally gets home, they're often more exhausted and mentally drained than they planned for. In that state, a pantry full of ingredients doesn't feel like opportunity. It feels like work. It feels like something that requires time, effort, and energy that just isn't available in that moment. And this is where the gap already exists, even under normal life conditions. Studies and real-world behavior show that more than half of home meals are already replaced with quick alternatives, not because people don't have food, but because they don't have the time or energy to turn ingredients into actual meals. The food is there, but the capacity to use it often isn't. Disruptions don't create this problem, they amplify it. Ready-to-eat foods are what fill that gap. They don't rely on cooking conditions, time, or mental energy. Instant noodles can provide roughly 350 calories per pack. A typical nutrition bar may offer around 200 calories. Dried fruit can supply quick, accessible energy that helps carry someone through several hours when nothing else is convenient. These are not meant to replace a balanced diet. Their purpose is much more practical. They act as a backup for the moments when cooking simply doesn't happen. Because when meals are skipped, the effects don't show up all at once. They build quietly. Energy drops step by step. Focus becomes narrower. Small frustrations start feeling bigger than they should. Over the course of just a few days, usually around 3 to 5, the impact on decision-making, mood, and physical performance becomes noticeable. Having even a short supply of ready-to-eat food helps prevent that decline and keeps basic functions steady while everything else is unsettled. And everything up to this point in the list assumes one more underlying factor that most people never really question. The final item is the one that determines whether any of these preparations actually work when they're needed most.